In the bustling city of Accra, where people hurried to work and vendors lined the streets selling everything from fruits to clothes, there was a small boy named James. James was only 12 years old, but he already knew a lot about survival. He had no father to guide him, no mother to comfort him, and no siblings to play with. He was alone, and every day was a challenge. Each morning, just as the sun peeked over the rooftops, James would get up from his tiny, makeshift shelter. It was just a small corner in a run-down alley, where he kept his few belongings in a small plastic bag. His bed was a flattened cardboard box, and his blanket was an old cloth he'd found one rainy night. But despite this hard life, James's spirit was strong. He believed that things would get better one day, so he got up every morning with a purpose. James's main job was selling Puff Puff, a small, golden-brown snack made of fried dough that was sweet and soft on the inside. He carried a tray of Puff Puffs balanced on his head, and he would walk around the busy streets calling out, "Puff Puff, fresh, hot Puff Puff, come and buy." His voice was loud, clear, and full of energy, and people would often stop to buy from him. Despite his hard work, James's income was small. Every day, after paying the lady who let him take Puff Puff on credit to sell, he was left with only a little cash. This money bought him just enough food to get by, and sometimes, he'd save a little for his dream. His dream was simple: to go to school one day. James loved the idea of school. Whenever he passed by a school, he'd stop for a moment to watch the children learning and playing together. It seemed like such a magical place, where kids wore uniforms and carried books, laughing and talking as they went in and out of classrooms. But James knew that school was a luxury he couldn't afford just yet. So, when he wasn't selling Puff Puff, he found other ways to earn money. One of his favorite ways was collecting bottles. He would search the streets, especially around busy markets and bus stops, looking for plastic bottles. Sometimes people threw them away carelessly, but to James, those bottles were valuable. He could sell them to recyclers for a small price, and every bottle brought him a little closer to his dream. One day, while picking bottles, James stumbled upon a small classroom where he heard a teacher's voice. The words seemed big and important, and James couldn't understand them all, but he listened, fascinated. The teacher was talking about math and science, and James felt a strange longing to be inside that classroom, learning like the other kids. That night, James sat on his cardboard bed, thinking about school. He imagined himself in a classroom, answering questions, writing on a chalkboard, and making friends. The thought filled him with a new energy, and he promised himself that one day, he would go to school. No matter how hard he had to work, he was going to make it happen. Days turned into weeks, and James saved every money he could. He worked long hours, sometimes skipping meals just to save a little extra. Finally, after many months of hard work, he had saved enough to buy a second-hand uniform and a few books. Trembling with excitement, James walked into a nearby school and asked to be enrolled. The teachers looked at him in surprise. He was just a small boy with torn clothes and rough hands. But when he showed them his savings and asked with such determination, they saw how serious he was. The teachers decided to help him. They arranged for him to attend classes, even though he didn't have a proper guardian or anyone to sign him up officially. James was overjoyed. He sat in the classroom with other kids, his eyes shining with excitement. He was finally where he had dreamed of being for so long. James quickly became one of the brightest students in the school. He was curious about everything, and he loved reading and solving math problems. The teachers were amazed at how much he wanted to learn. Even though he didn't have anyone to help him with homework or buy him new clothes, he always came to school with a smile on his face, ready to learn. But school was only half the battle. James still needed to survive, so after classes, he would go back to selling Puff Puff and collecting bottles. His life was a balance of school and work, and he rarely had time for play. Yet, he didn't mind. He knew he was building a future for himself, one small step at a time. One day, while walking back from school, James felt a deep pang of loneliness. He saw other children with their parents, laughing and talking as they walked home together. They held hands, their parents carrying their bags and asking about their day. James felt a tightness in his chest, a feeling he tried to ignore but couldn't. No matter how hard he worked or how many coins he saved, he was still alone. But James was a resilient boy. He wiped his tears and told himself that he didn't need anyone. He had gotten this far on his own, and he would keep going. He promised himself that one day, he would be successful, and he would never have to feel lonely again. James's days at school quickly turned into years. He never let go of his street jobs and even worked harder to support his studies. His routine was relentless: wake up early, sell puff-puff, attend classes, collect bottles after school, and study late into the night. This rhythm became his life, and every day he grew stronger, both in body and spirit. James graduated from secondary school with high honors, making his teachers proud. They marveled at how far he'd come, knowing he'd done it all alone. Some teachers even tried to find out more about his family, but James would shake his head and change the subject. For him, his family was the dream of a brighter future, the goal that kept him moving forward. After secondary school, James decided to take a break from studies. He knew he needed more money to pay for higher education, so he focused on growing his recycling business. Now, instead of only picking bottles, he set up a system where people would bring bottles to him, and he paid them a small fee. Slowly, other boys from the street, who also had nowhere to go, started working with him. James taught them how to sort the bottles, how to talk to customers, and how to manage the small earnings they made. Business was growing, and soon James was able to expand beyond just bottles. He began collecting plastic bags, cans, and even small metal scraps. His recycling venture became well known in the area, and people would come from different neighborhoods to sell their recyclables to him. James was thrilled. His business gave him a sense of purpose and pride, and for the first time in his life, he felt like he was on his way to achieving something big. Finally, with enough money saved, James enrolled himself in a university. He was nervous and excited, knowing that this was a huge step. University life was a different world, full of bright minds, books, and endless opportunities to learn. James's dedication made him a star among his classmates. Professors noticed his sharp questions and thoughtful answers, and they admired his relentless drive. However, even as his life seemed to get better, James couldn't shake off the feeling of loneliness that lingered in his heart. Whenever there were celebrations, he would see his classmates with their families, laughing and taking pictures together. James watched them from a distance, always feeling like an outsider. He tried to focus on his studies and his growing business, telling himself that one day, he would find someone to share his success with. 2 years into university, James's recycling business had grown larger than he ever imagined. He had hired several boys from the street, giving them steady work and helping them avoid the dangers he'd once faced. They all respected James and looked up to him, seeing him as someone who had risen from the same streets and succeeded. One day, James got a surprise visitor at his recycling center. A representative from the Accra state government had come to speak with him. The man introduced himself with a smile and explained that the government had noticed James's efforts to clean up the city and reduce waste. They were impressed by his impact and wanted to support him in expanding his operations further. "We've seen young people like you rise from difficult situations, but your work is inspiring, James. We believe you have the power to make an even bigger difference," the man said with admiration. James couldn't believe it. Not long ago, he was just a boy picking bottles off the streets, and now, the government wanted to work with him. This opportunity was more than he could have dreamed. He immediately accepted the offer and, with the government's support, his business grew beyond anything he could have imagined. His recycling center expanded to several locations, and he even started working with companies to recycle on a larger scale. With his recycling empire blossoming, James had more money than he'd ever known. He remembered the days when he barely had enough for food, and now he could afford anything he wanted. He bought a modest but comfortable apartment, got himself new clothes, and began to live a life he had only imagined in his dreams. But even with all the success, he still felt a deep emptiness. Graduation day arrived, and though he was surrounded by cheering classmates, James couldn't shake the feeling of loneliness. His classmates were busy with their families, hugging them and celebrating their achievements. James stood alone, watching them with a tightness in his chest, his heart heavy with longing. And then, as he was about to leave, he met Sarah. Sarah was one of the few people in his class he'd noticed but never really spoken to. She was always kind to everyone and had a warm, inviting smile that lit up any room. On that day, she noticed James standing alone, looking lost in thought. Without hesitation, she walked over and introduced herself. "You don't have anyone here, do you?" she asked gently, her eyes full of understanding. James felt a lump in his throat and nodded. For the first time in a long while, he felt seen. Sarah smiled and handed him her phone. "Here, let's take a picture together. We can celebrate together." They took a few photos, and James felt the loneliness lift, even if just for a moment. They talked for hours, sharing stories about their lives and their dreams. Sarah asked him about his business, and though James was initially hesitant, he opened up about his recycling company and his journey from the streets to where he was now. Sarah listened with admiration and encouragement, making James feel valued in a way he hadn't before. When they parted ways, they exchanged numbers and promised to keep in touch. For the first time, James had someone he could call a friend. Over the next few months, Sarah became a central part of his life. They spent time together, sharing meals, going to parks, and talking about their hopes for the future. Sarah was fascinated by James's business and even offered him ideas to make it more efficient. One evening, as they discussed new ways to reach more people with his recycling program, Sarah suggested a unique partnership with local businesses. She explained how the partnership could benefit both parties and even bring more attention to his work. James was impressed by her insight and decided to put her idea into action. Her idea worked wonders. Not only did his business grow, but it also caught the attention of the media, and soon enough, people across Accra were talking about James's impact on the environment. Grateful and overwhelmed by her support, James realized he was falling in love with Sarah. He saw in her everything he had dreamed of in a partner: kindness, intelligence, and a heart full of compassion. She had given him something he had been searching for his entire life: a sense of belonging. As his feelings for her deepened, James began to think about building a future together. He had finally found someone who cared for him, who believed in him, and who was willing to stand by his side through every challenge. The lonely boy who once roamed the streets of Accra now dreamed of a life filled with love and companionship, all because of Sarah. Sarah became the light in James's life, a steady friend and a comforting presence. With her, he felt safe to share his dreams and fears, something he'd never had the chance to do before. Their friendship quickly grew stronger, and soon enough, James realized he wanted to be with Sarah not just as a friend, but as a life partner. After one particularly successful business event, Sarah and James went out to celebrate. They spent hours laughing and talking about everything, from his childhood on the streets to her own dreams of making a difference in the world. Sarah was passionate about helping people, and her kindness was what had first drawn James to her. He couldn't help but think that meeting her was like finding the missing piece of his life. Over the next few weeks, they spent even more time together. James was amazed by how Sarah seemed to understand him better than anyone ever had. One evening, as they were walking by the beach, James gathered the courage to share his feelings. "Sarah," he began, his voice soft, "I don't know how to say this, but you've changed my life in ways I never thought possible. I don't know where I'd be without you. You've been there for me, supported me, and believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself." Sarah listened quietly, her gaze never leaving his. She had a gentle smile on her face, and James felt his heart race as he continued. I don't want to just be friends, Sarah. I love you, and I want to be with you." For a moment, there was silence as she processed his words. Then, to his relief, Sarah reached for his hand and squeezed it gently. "I love you too, James," she replied softly. "I've been waiting for you to say that." James's heart soared. He felt like all the loneliness he'd ever felt was finally fading, replaced by a warmth he hadn't known he needed. They walked together in silence, hand in hand, both feeling as if they had found exactly what they'd been searching for. Their relationship blossomed, and before long, they were making plans for a future together. Sarah continued to help James with his business, bringing fresh ideas and a new perspective that kept things exciting and innovative. With her by his side, James felt invincible. The business grew even faster, catching the attention of more influential figures in Accra and beyond. But life, as always, had its own plans. One afternoon, James was at home, going over some business documents, when the doorbell rang. He wasn't expecting anyone, so he was curious as to who it could be. When he opened the door, he saw an older woman, her face lined with wrinkles and her clothes worn and faded. She looked tired and fragile, her hands trembling slightly as she held onto a small bag. James didn't recognize her at first, but there was something hauntingly familiar in her eyes. She looked at him with a mix of hope and regret, her voice soft as she said, "James, my son." His heart stopped. The word son echoed in his mind, filling him with a mixture of shock and disbelief. This woman, his mother. After all these years. He took a step back, his mind racing. Memories of his childhood came flooding back, the endless days on the streets, the loneliness, the struggle to survive. All of it because she had left him. He felt a rush of anger, pain, and betrayal. How could she show up now, after he'd worked so hard to make something of himself? "What do you want?" he asked, his voice cold and distant. Mama Abina's face fell, and she lowered her gaze. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, James. I was young, foolish, and I didn't know how to be a mother. I made mistakes. I left you because I thought you'd be better off. But I was wrong. I've regretted it every day since." Her words stirred something deep inside him, but his anger was stronger. How could he forgive her, after everything she had put him through? He wanted to slam the door and pretend she'd never come, to keep the life he'd built for himself without her presence to disturb it. Just as he was about to send her away, Sarah entered the room. She looked at the woman kneeling at the door and then at James, her face filled with confusion. "Who is this?" she asked softly. James panicked. He didn't want Sarah to know the truth, didn't want her to see this broken, painful part of his past. Without thinking, he answered, She's my maid." Mama Abina's eyes widened in shock, but she didn't say a word. She looked at her son with sadness, realizing the extent of his hurt. Silently, she accepted his lie and lowered her head, her hands trembling as she clutched her small bag. Sarah was surprised but didn't question it further. She trusted James, and if he said this woman was a maid, she believed him. However, she couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. There was a tension in James's voice, a hint of bitterness she hadn't heard before. She watched as he looked away, his face hard and unreadable. James allowed Mema Abina to stay, but his intentions were clear. He wanted her to feel the pain he had felt. He assigned her tasks around the house, giving her the role of a live-in maid every morning. Mema Abina would wake early, silently preparing breakfast, cleaning the house, and completing the endless tasks James assigned. She never complained, accepting her role without question. Her eyes held a quiet sadness, but she carried herself with a sense of resignation, as if she believed she deserved this treatment. James's resentment simmered every time he saw her. He remembered the nights he had spent alone on the streets, wondering why he had no family, why he was different from other children. All the hurt he had kept inside for so long seemed to fuel his anger now. He wanted her to feel the emptiness he had lived with, the loneliness he had fought against every day. Sarah, however, was not oblivious to his behavior. She watched the way James treated Mama Abina, her concern growing with each passing day. She knew James had been through a lot, but the harshness he showed this old woman disturbed her. The kindness she had always admired in him seemed to vanish whenever he looked at Mama Abina. One day, Sarah decided to address it. She found James in his office, sitting at his desk, deep in thought. She approached him quietly and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "James," she said softly, "I need to talk to you about something." He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "I don't understand why you're so harsh with her. I know there's a lot of pain, but she's an old woman now. Every time you shout at her or make her work beyond her strength, it feels wrong." James's jaw tightened, and he turned away, avoiding her gaze. He knew she was right, but the anger was hard to release. It had become a part of him, something he had clung to for so long that it felt like letting it go would mean losing a part of himself. "She doesn't deserve my kindness, Sarah," he replied, his voice low and strained. "She left me when I was just a child. I was alone, all those years. She was supposed to be my mother, but she abandoned me." Sarah nodded, understanding his pain but also seeing the toll it was taking on him. She sat down beside him, her hand resting gently on his. "James, I can't imagine what you went through. But I see what this anger is doing to you. You've worked so hard to build a good life for yourself, to find happiness. Don't let this bitterness poison it. You don't have to forgive her fully right away, but maybe there's a middle ground." James listened, his heart heavy. Part of him wanted to let go of the anger, but another part of him clung to it, afraid that forgiving her would somehow erase all the pain he had endured. That evening, while James was still wrestling with his feelings, something happened that forced him to confront his emotions head-on. He was in the living room when he heard raised voices from the kitchen. Curious, he went to see what was happening, only to find Sarah talking to Mama Abina. Sarah's voice was gentle, but firm, as she tried to comfort her. "Mama Abina, I know things have been difficult, but you don't have to feel like you're just a maid here. You're family." Mama Abina's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. "No, my dear. I don't deserve to be treated as family. I left James when he needed me the most. He has every right to hate me." Her words struck James like a blow. For the first time, he saw the depth of her regret, the guilt she carried with her every day. She wasn't just an old woman trying to stay in his life, she was a mother desperate for a second chance. Sarah turned to James, her eyes pleading. "James, I think it's time you both talked about what happened. Really talked." James felt a surge of anger and pain rise within him, but he knew Sarah was right. Avoiding the conversation wouldn't change anything. He nodded reluctantly, and Sarah left the kitchen, giving them privacy. Was determined to make her feel the weight of his resentment, the burden of the years she had abandoned him. Every day, he watched her scrub the floors, wash the dishes, and tend to the house, all the while hiding the pain in her eyes. He could tell that she was suffering, but a part of him reveled in it. It was the closest he could get to making her understand the agony he had lived through. Yet, as days passed, something began to change. James's anger, though strong, started to waver. There were moments when he would find her sitting quietly, her hands folded in her lap, staring into space. The emptiness in her eyes mirrored his own, and it made him pause. Was this truly what he wanted? To break her as she had broken him? Sarah, too, noticed the change. She saw the way James's attitude towards his mother had shifted from cold indifference to something deeper, perhaps a form of guilt, or maybe the beginnings of a painful healing process. One evening, when James was sitting alone on the balcony, staring out over the city, Sarah approached him. "James," she said softly, "I know there's something you're not telling me about her, about your mother." James's heart skipped a beat. He had never been good at hiding his emotions, but this was something different. He had kept his past buried deep, and now, Sarah's words were threatening to unravel everything. "I've never had a mother, Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She left me when I was just a baby. I grew up on the streets, alone. And now she shows up, expecting forgiveness. But I can't just let go of all the years of pain." Sarah sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his. "I understand that, James. But holding on to that hurt, it's only going to keep you trapped in the past. You've built a life for yourself, a future. Don't let her ruin that." James turned to look at her, his eyes searching hers. She was right. Holding on to the pain, the anger, was like carrying a weight he didn't need anymore. But forgiving her, that seemed impossible. That night, as James lay in bed, he could hear Mama Abina moving about the house, silently fulfilling her duties. Every creak of the floorboards seemed to echo his inner turmoil. The anger that had driven him for so long began to feel like a cage, trapping him in a cycle of bitterness. The next morning, James awoke early. He walked into the kitchen, where Mama Abina was preparing breakfast, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't look up when he entered, but James could feel her awareness of his presence. "James," she said quietly, "I know you don't want me here. I understand, but I need to tell you something." Her voice trembled as she turned to face him. "The truth is, I never wanted to leave you. I was young, scared, and unable to care for you the way I should have. I've regretted it every single day, and I've been searching for a way to make up for it. But I know I can never erase the past." James stood frozen, the words sinking into him like a stone in water. Could this be the mother he had dreamed of finding all these years? The one who regretted leaving him? His emotions were a tangled mess of confusion and pain. Before he could respond, Sarah entered the room, sensing the tension between them. She looked from James to his mother, then back at him, her face filled with concern. "James," she said softly, "maybe this is a conversation you need to have alone." But James didn't move. He couldn't. The weight of everything, his past, his pain, the resentment, and the faint glimmer of forgiveness, was crashing down on him all at once. "I don't know what to do anymore," he confessed, his voice breaking. "I've built my life from the ground up, and now I don't know if I can let go of the anger. I don't know if I can forgive her." Sarah stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to forgive her all at once. Take it one step at a time, James. Forgiveness isn't a switch you flip. It's a journey, and maybe this is the first step." James nodded, feeling an unexpected wave of relief wash over him. It wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could breathe again. As the days passed, James began to open up more to his mother. He would watch her silently as she worked, and slowly, he started to see her not just as the woman who had abandoned him, but as a person who had suffered too. Each small conversation with her was a step towards healing, but he still couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, something was still broken, deep inside. Then, one fateful evening, as James sat with Sarah, his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but when he answered, his heart stopped. "James," the voice on the other end said, "we need to talk. It's about your business, and your family. There's something you need to know." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His business, which had once been his pride and joy, was now at risk. But this wasn't just about money, it was about something much deeper, something tied to his family and his past. What had he unknowingly stumbled into? Kept his distance from Mama Abina, using her presence as a constant reminder of the abandonment he had endured as a child. He had worked so hard to build a life for himself, to rise from the streets, and now that he had everything he'd ever wanted, he felt justified in making her feel the sting of his years of suffering. Each task he assigned her seemed like another punishment for her failure to be the mother he needed. But deep down, James couldn't ignore the small part of him that still longed for the connection he had lost. There were moments when he saw her sitting quietly, her hands folded in her lap, and he felt a strange pull in his chest. In those rare moments, he would catch a glimpse of the woman who had given birth to him, the woman who had, for better or worse, shaped his life. He couldn't deny that there was still a wound there, a deep scar that no amount of success or money could erase. As the days passed, Sarah continued to be supportive, unaware of the emotional battle James was fighting. She noticed the tension, the way James would grow distant whenever Mama Abina was around. But she respected his space, thinking that perhaps it was just a complicated family situation he didn't want to talk about. However, one evening, as James and Sarah sat on the balcony of his apartment, looking out at the city lights below, Sarah asked the question she had been holding in her heart for weeks. "James, I've noticed something. The way you act around your mother." Her voice was gentle, but the concern in her eyes was unmistakable. "I don't want to push, but I think you need to talk about it. It's okay to be angry, but it's also okay to heal." James's heart clenched at her words. He hadn't realized how much he had been hiding from her, how much pain he had kept buried. His first instinct was to shut down, to tell her it was none of her business, but something inside him stopped him. Sarah had always been there for him, and this was the first time she was truly trying to understand the core of his struggle. He took a deep breath, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah, she left me. She left me on the streets when I was just a boy. I had to survive on my own, to grow up too quickly, to fight every single day for what little I had. And now, she comes back, acting like nothing ever happened. She wants forgiveness, but I don't know if I can give it to her." Sarah reached out and placed her hand on his. "James, I know you've been through so much. But holding on to all that pain, all that anger, it's not going to help you heal. You're so much more than your past. And she's still your mother. I know it's complicated, but don't you think it's time to face it?" James sat in silence, looking out at the city. Her words echoed in his mind. Could he really let go of the pain? Could he allow himself to forgive her? Over the next few weeks, James's relationship with his mother continued to evolve. He still treated her as a maid, but there was a shift in the way he observed her. He started to notice the subtle ways she cared for him, how she would make his favorite meal when he was working late, how she would silently tidy up his office without being asked. He realized that, despite everything, she was trying in her own way to make up for the years she had missed. One evening, after a particularly long day, James sat down at the dinner table, his mind swirling with confusion and hurt. Mama Abina quietly set the food in front of him and sat down across from him. For the first time in a long while, she met his eyes, and there was something in her gaze, something raw and vulnerable. "I'm sorry, James," she said, her voice trembling. "I never meant to hurt you. I was so lost back then, but I've never stopped thinking about you. I've always wanted to come back, to make things right, but I didn't know how." James stared at her, the anger in his chest bubbling up, but this time, it felt different. It was no longer just a wall of bitterness and resentment, it was something more complex. He looked at the woman before him, his mother, and he saw the years of regret, the weight of her own struggles. He took a deep breath, his voice steady but unsure. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Mama. But I want to try. I don't want to keep carrying this anger." Mama Abina's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded. "I understand. I will do whatever it takes." From that night on, things slowly began to change. It wasn't an immediate transformation, but little by little, James allowed himself to soften toward her. He started talking to her, not just about the past, but about his life now, his business, his dreams, his struggles. And slowly, Mama Rabina began to open up as well, telling him about her own pain, her mistakes, and the regret she had carried for so many years. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was a start. James learned that healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant allowing himself to feel the pain, to confront it, and to choose whether or not he wanted to carry it any longer. And in the process, he found a part of himself that had been lost, a part that was willing to forgive, to love, and to move forward. As for Sarah, she stood by James every step of the way. She was patient, understanding, and supportive, helping him navigate the complexities of his past while encouraging him to build a future that was no longer defined by it. With Sarah by his side, James felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that he was no longer alone. Join me next time for part 2 of this captivating story. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Before you go, help me grow this community. Hit that like button for more thrilling content, subscribe for new uploads, comment below with your theories and reactions, share with friends and family who love a good story. I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for being an amazing part of this journey.